May 1968, the Central Highlands of Vietnam. First Lieutenant Robin Bartlett crouched behind a rice paddy dike as mortar rounds exploded around him in the darkness. He was 22 years old. He'd been in country for less than 3 months. His men were dying around him, some already dead, others screaming for medics. Shrapnel tore through his shoulder, spinning him backward. His helmet flew off. Then another explosion, this one directly in front of him. The mortar round buried itself in the mud before detonating, the only thing that saved his life. But shrapnel caught him in the groin, kicking him back violently. His head struck the concrete hard rice paddy dike, and everything went black. When they pulled back the dead and wounded, they put Robin in the dead pile. He had blood all over him, no pulse they could find in the chaos. It would be hours before someone heard him moan and realized the lieutenant wasn't dead after all. This is Robin Bartlett's story, a young college graduate who volunteered for the most dangerous assignments the Army could offer, spent a year walking point through triple-canopy jungle, learned that staying alive meant putting his men before body counts, and came home to parents who met every single flight from Vietnam for 5 days straight because they didn't know which one would bring their son home alive. It's a story about leadership under impossible conditions, about the daily terror of walking the trail through hostile jungle where the enemy chose when and where to fight, about learning to read the silence of the jungle when the birds stopped singing, and about 2 words, welcome home, that can still bring tears to a Vietnam veteran's eyes more than 50 years later. Robin Bartlett was born in Sacramento, California, but he came from a military family. His grandfather served, his father served, his brother served. Growing up, the family moved constantly. Robin attended 13 different elementary and middle schools. By the time he was old enough to make his own choices, he'd had enough of the military lifestyle. He wanted stability. He wanted California. He wanted college. In 1963, Robin enrolled at Claremont McKenna College in Southern California, east of Los Angeles. It was a private liberal arts school with an excellent reputation. He started as a political science and economics major, but eventually switched to comparative literature, combining literature with French. That French language training would prove unexpectedly relevant in the years to come, though Robin couldn't have known it at the time. But in 1967, everything changed. Between his freshman and sophomore years, Robin was reclassified by his draft board. He went from student deferment to 1A, draft eligible. The Vietnam War was building to its height. President Lyndon Johnson had escalated American involvement, and young men across the country were receiving their draft notices. Robin looked at his options and made a decision. Not for me. He wasn't going to be drafted into the infantry with no control over his future. If he was going to serve, and clearly he was going to do it on his own terms. He joined the Reserve Officers Training Corps. He would fulfill his obligation as an officer, not as a draftee. But Robin didn't stop there. He decided to volunteer for the most aggressive and arduous training the Army offered, Airborne Ranger School, with an assignment to the 82nd Airborne Division. He got everything he volunteered for. After an introductory month with the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Robin was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia. First came jump school, 4 weeks learning to parachute from aircraft, then 6 weeks of infantry officer basic course, learning the fundamentals of leading soldiers in combat. And finally, the big one, Ranger School. Robin would later describe Ranger School as the most arduous training he'd ever experienced. The objective wasn't just physical conditioning or tactical knowledge. The objective was to push soldiers to the absolute edge of human endurance, physically and mentally, and then make them lead. Students at Ranger School received 1 meal a day. They were kept in a state of constant exhaustion and hunger. And when they reached that point of total exhaustion, that's when the instructors made them take charge. That's when they had to lead patrols, make decisions, and accomplish missions. If your patrol made its objective, you got fed. If you failed, you went hungry. Robin lost 25 pounds during Ranger School. He would eventually put it all back on, but those weeks of deprivation and exhaustion taught him something crucial: how to function when your body and mind are screaming at you to quit, how to lead when you can barely think straight, how to keep going when every instinct tells you to stop. One lesson from Ranger School would prove particularly valuable in Vietnam. Never follow roads, never follow trails. The enemy owned the trails. They could ambush you at will. If you wanted to survive, you had to cut your own path through the jungle, no matter how exhausting, no matter how slow. Robin didn't know it yet, but Ranger School was his best insurance policy for surviving Vietnam. After 6 months back with the 82nd Airborne Division, Robin received his orders. He was being transferred to Vietnam. There was some initial confusion about exactly which unit he'd be joining, and he wasn't told until the middle of the night on his last day stateside. At 2 o'clock in the morning, someone woke him up. "You're going to the 101st? No, wait. You're going to the First Cavalry Division. Get ready to go at 6 o'clock. It was May 9th, 1968. Robin was on his way to war. The 1st Cavalry Division had an excellent reputation. It had more helicopters than any other unit in Vietnam, which meant soldiers flew everywhere instead of walking. That was good news. You could carry more water and ammunition and less weight on your back. The bad news was that it also meant an enormous number of helicopter combat assaults, called Charlie Alphas in military jargon. Combat assaults were traumatic, always. You flew into a landing zone in a Huey helicopter, not knowing if enemy soldiers were waiting in the tree line with machine guns. The doors were open. You were exposed. And when the helicopter touched down, or more often hovered a few feet off the ground, you had to jump out and run for cover while bullets might be snapping past your head. But before Robin experienced his first combat assault, he had to acclimate to Vietnam itself. The environment was unlike anything he'd experienced, even in the Louisiana swamps during Special Forces training. In triple-canopy jungle, where 3 layers of trees blocked out most of the sunlight, the heat was magnified by humidity, so intense it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Temperatures routinely exceeded 100 degrees. The jungle was so thick in places that you couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. And because of Agent Orange contamination, soldiers weren't allowed to drink from streams or purify water from natural sources. Water had to be brought in by helicopter every day. If the helicopters could land, they'd bring in water containers. If they couldn't land, they'd kick the containers out as they flew over. Each soldier got enough water to drink, period. Robin brushed his teeth. That was it. No shaving, no washing. You wore the same clothes in the field for an average of 4 to 6 weeks. It got pretty stinky after about the 3rd day, Robin recalled, but then you got used to it. Food was sea rations, canned military meals that had been around since World War II. Every night, if possible, a helicopter would bring in water, sea rations, and additional ammunition. Occasionally, the cooks would come out and soldiers would get a hot meal. You might have breakfast for dinner or dinner for breakfast, depending on helicopter availability. The cooks hated being in the field, no matter how secure the position. Each night with the resupply, soldiers got 1 Coke and 1 beer. The logistics guys would put them in a waterproof bag with ice, which would melt by the time it reached the field. So every night, you got a lukewarm beer and a lukewarm Coke. The liquid was the best, Robin said. This was Robin's new normal. Heat, humidity, leeches, sea rations, and the trail. Walking the trail was the experience that defined Vietnam for every soldier who served there. It was the relentless daily grind that nobody who experienced it ever forgot. Years later, Robin would write a short story about the trail, trying to capture what it meant to move through hostile jungle day after day, knowing the enemy could be anywhere, knowing they could hit you at any time. The first rule, drilled into Robin during Ranger School, was to stay off main trails. If you followed an established trail, the possibility of ambush was much higher. The enemy knew those trails. They watched them, they booby-trapped them, they set up ambush positions along them. So American units had to cut their own paths through the jungle. Cutting trail meant moving single file with a point man at the front, chopping through vegetation with a machete. The point man had to hack through what soldiers called wait-a-minute vines, thorny vegetation that grabbed your clothes and equipment, forcing you to stop and untangle yourself. The point man had to be rotated every 10 to 15 minutes because the physical exertion in the heat was so extreme that men would keel over from heat exhaustion or heat stroke. Behind the point man man came the cover man, whose job was to protect the point man while he was occupied with the machete. Then came the rest of the platoon in single file, each man responsible for watching a sector, trying to spot the enemy before the enemy spotted them. The trail often led through rice paddies, which presented their own special horror, leeches. The water was infested with them. Even though soldiers tied their pants down tight at the ankles, the leeches always found a way in. They'd work their way up your legs toward your groin. After crossing water, everybody would stop, take off their pants, and search for leeches. There were two methods for removing them: burn them off with a lit cigarette or squirt them with insect repellent. It was unavoidable, just another part of life on the trail. The jungle itself was watching you. Robin learned to read the signs. If you were moving through the jungle and you didn't hear birds, didn't hear monkeys, something was wrong. The animals knew when predators were near. The point man would develop an intuitive feeling, a sixth sense that something wasn't right. He'd call Robin forward. "Sir, I don't like what's going on up here." Robin's usual reaction was what he called reconnaissance by fire. He'd call for artillery strikes in front of the platoon's position and blow away everything ahead of them before they walked through. Robin called in so much artillery that his superiors actually had to put him on a budget, but his men felt much more comfortable walking through an area after Robin had saturated it with high explosives. Robin arrived in Vietnam as a second lieutenant. Within 3 weeks, he was promoted to first lieutenant. He was 22 years old, responsible for the lives of 30 to 40 men, most of whom were older than him. One of the smartest things Robin did when he took over his platoon was sit down with his platoon sergeant and squad leaders and listen to them. He trusted their experience, and they came to understand that Robin's first priority in a firefight was their welfare, keeping his men alive, not body counts. That approach probably meant Robin would never be a successful infantry commander by the Army's metrics. The official priority was attacking the enemy and generating body counts, the statistics that headquarters used to measure success. But that wasn't Robin's priority. His priority was bringing his men home alive. That didn't mean Robin's platoon didn't fight. When you were ambushed, the worst thing you could do was hug the ground and pray. That was a guarantee of total annihilation. You had to attack. You had to maneuver. You had to fight your way out of the kill zone. Robin's men understood that. 90% of them were draftees, and they wanted to complete their tours just as much as Robin wanted to complete his. But Robin took every precaution he could to keep his men alive, and his men noticed. They trusted him. In Vietnam, where platoon leaders supposedly had a survival rate of less than 90 days, that trust was everything. The problem was that platoon leaders were easy to spot, and therefore prime targets for enemy snipers. Robin was the man with the map in his thigh pocket, with the radio operator walking behind him, an antenna sticking up above his head. Enemy soldiers knew that in a single file formation, after the point man and cover man, and maybe 1 or 2 other soldiers, came the leader. Robin learned to hit the ground instantaneously at the first crack of a rifle shot. His men learned to do the same, but the danger was constant. One morning, Robin was on a night defensive position when he had to relieve himself. He made a decision he would regret for the rest of the day. He didn't take his weapon with him. He walked into the brush just a few meters, maybe 15 feet, did his business, pulled up his pants, and looked up. There was an enemy soldier about 50 feet away. The soldier didn't have a weapon in his hands, but he was definitely North Vietnamese Army. He wore the uniform. For a moment, Robin and the enemy soldier simply stared at each other. It scared Robin more than almost anything else in Vietnam. Then the enemy soldier waved at him. Robin realized later that this was an observer tracking their unit's movements. The soldier was young, probably younger than Robin. They looked at each other for maybe 2 seconds before Robin turned and ran like hell back to his perimeter. Robin never made the mistake of leaving his rifle behind again. From that moment forward, his weapon was married to him, but not all encounters ended with a wave. On another patrol, Robin's point man heard an enemy soldier coming up the trail. Robin moved forward to the point position. As he arrived, Here came an enemy soldier walking up the trail. The soldier's weapon was on his shoulder. Robin's was in his hands. Robin flipped the selector switch on his M16 to full automatic. When an M16 fires on full automatic, it can expend 18 rounds of ammunition in 2.5 seconds. You point the weapon and pull the trigger. That's exactly what happened. The rounds crossed the enemy soldier's body, and he was dead before he hit the ground. It was that fast, that clinical, that final. Night operations in Vietnam were particularly dangerous. Every night, each platoon would send out an ambush patrol to watch for enemy movement. And every night, the soldiers knew the enemy was watching them. One night, Robin's ambush patrol had to cross a rice paddy to reach their assigned position. As they crossed the open ground, the enemy opened fire with machine guns. Mortar rounds started dropping around them. Robin had men wounded immediately. Others were killed in the first seconds of the ambush. Robin called for artillery support. His men took cover behind a rice paddy dike, basically a raised barrier of packed earth that was as hard as concrete. A mortar round exploded on the other side of the dike. Shrapnel caught Robin in the shoulder and kicked him backward. His helmet came off. Then another mortar round exploded directly in front of him. The round hit the mud before it detonated, the only thing that saved Robin's life. But shrapnel caught him in the groin, kicking him back violently. His head struck the rice paddy dike and he lost consciousness. Robin's squad leader took immediate action, pulling the dead and wounded back to the original perimeter. When they reached safety and assessed casualties, they thought Robin was dead. He had blood all over him. They couldn't find a pulse in the darkness and chaos. They put him in the dead pile with the other killed in action soldiers. Robin woke up after a while and sat up, but by that time he'd lost so much blood that he immediately fainted. Nobody saw him. The second time he woke up, he managed to moan. Someone shouted, "Hey, he's not dead!" They came over, bandaged him to stop the bleeding, and made him as comfortable as possible. But it was the middle of the night. They couldn't bring in a medevac helicopter until dawn. Robin lay there from about 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock the next morning, bleeding, in pain, wondering if he was going to die. At first light, the medevac arrived. Robin was flown to a hospital ship where doctors sewed him up and gave him several pints of blood. After 2 days, they sent him back to his battalion, with orders for 10 days of light duty. Robin spent those 10 days writing up award citations for the men who'd saved his life. Then he went back to the field and rejoined his platoon. He'd defied the odds. He'd survived as a platoon leader far longer than 90 days. Now he just had to make it to the end of his tour. There was one position on the trail even more terrifying than platoon leader: walking point. The point man was at the absolute front of the formation, the first person to encounter booby traps, ambushes, or enemy soldiers. It was the most dangerous job in the platoon. Robin walked point exactly once. He wanted the experience. He wanted to understand what his point men went through every day. His platoon sergeant tried to talk him out of it. "Sir, don't do it. Don't walk point," Robin insisted. He needed to know what it felt like. It was the most frightening experience of Robin's entire tour in Vietnam. As he moved forward, he had to constantly look ahead for the enemy while simultaneously looking down for booby traps. Up, down, up, down. His head was on a swivel. He was sweating so much that his hands became slippery on the stock of his rifle. He carried his weapon on full automatic with the safety off, standard procedure for point men. It wasn't unusual for a point man to trip, fall, and accidentally pull the trigger, causing everyone to hit the ground before realizing it was a false alarm. Robin's hands were shaking. His heart was pounding. Every shadow could be an enemy soldier. Every vine could be a tripwire. Every depression in the ground could be a pungy pit filled with sharpened bamboo stakes covered in human waste. When Robin finally reached the night defensive position, he was mentally and physically exhausted. He never walked point again, but he understood. He understood what his men went through, and they respected him for trying. Robin Bartlett survived his tour in Vietnam, 365 days. He'd been wounded. He'd been put in the dead pile and survived. He'd lost men under his command. He'd killed enemy soldiers. He'd walked the trail through triple-canopy jungle in heat and humidity that would have broken most people. And now it was time to go home. Robin wrote to his parents and told them he'd be returning sometime between May 7th 10th and May 11th, 1969, but he couldn't give them an exact date. On May 9th, exactly 1 year after he'd arrived in Vietnam, Robin received his orders. He left his unit at 5 or 6 in the morning, Vietnam time. The flight back to the United States took nearly a full day. When Robin's plane landed at Travis Air Force Base in California, it was about 11 o'clock at night local time. Robin looked out the airplane window and saw 2 people standing on the other side of the fence near the hangar, a man and a woman. "Those are my parents," Robin said to nobody in particular. He got off the airplane, walked up to the fence, and kissed his mother through the chain link. She didn't recognize him until he was 2 feet in front of her. All the returning soldiers looked the same in their fatigues, thin and exhausted and aged beyond their years. Robin's parents had met every single flight returning from Vietnam from May 6th until he arrived. Every flight, no matter what time of day or night. They didn't know which plane would bring their son home, so they met them all. That was Robin's homecoming, not protesters spitting on him, not angry crowds calling him a baby killer, just his parents who'd waited by the fence for 5 days, meeting every plane, praying each time that their son would be on it. On March 29, 1973, the last American combat troops boarded planes and left Vietnam. The war would continue for 2 more years before South Vietnam finally fell, but America's direct involvement was over. March 29th is now recognized as National Vietnam War Veterans Day. Many Americans, when they meet a Vietnam veteran today, say, "Thank you for your service." It's a nice sentiment, and Robin and other veterans appreciate it. But there's something else you can say to a Vietnam veteran that carries much more weight. 2 words that have special meaning for the men who fought in that war and came home to a country that largely ignored or condemned them. Welcome home. Those 2 words, welcome home, carry enormous power for Vietnam veterans. Say them to a veteran and watch the reaction. You'll see tears come to their eyes. You'll see lumps form in their throats, because for many of them, nobody ever said those words when they returned from the war. They came back individually, not in units like World War II veterans. They came back to a country that wanted to forget Vietnam ever happened. Robin Bartlett walked the trail through Vietnam's jungles for 365 days. He led men in combat. He called in artillery strikes that saved his platoon from annihilation. He survived being wounded and put in the dead pile. He made decisions every day that determined whether his men lived or died. And when he came home, his parents were waiting by the fence. More than 50 years later, Robin can still remember exactly what it felt like to walk point that one time. He can still remember the sound of mortar rounds dropping around him in the darkness. He can still remember the faces of the men he lost. And he can still remember what it meant to see his parents waiting on the other side of that fence at Travis Air Force Base. Walking the trail in Vietnam was an experience that marked every soldier who went through it. The daily grind of moving through hostile jungle, knowing the enemy was watching, knowing they could hit you at any moment. The heat and humidity and leeches and exhaustion, the constant fear mixed with boredom, mixed with brief moments of absolute terror. Robin Bartlett's story is one of millions from the Vietnam War, but it's worth remembering because it shows what leadership looks like under impossible conditions, what it means to put your men first, even when headquarters wants body counts, what it costs to survive 365 days in a war where the enemy chooses when and where to fight. And it reminds us why those 2 words, welcome home, mean so much to the men who walked that trail and made it back alive. Welcome home, Robin Bartlett. Welcome home to all Vietnam veterans. Your service mattered, your sacrifices mattered, and your stories matter. The trail may have ended decades ago, but its lessons live on in the men who walked it and survived to tell the tale.